Welcome to Paul's epistle to the Ephesians. This is a study we're doing at Long Branch Covenant Church, but putting it up here on YouTube for everyone or anyone who wants to do some in-depth study on the epistle to the Ephesian church. And this is the first part of the first session, where there's two parts. So this session will run about 45 minutes, but I believe you'll find some really helpful information both in the books and in the background that I provide for this study on Ephesians. Ephesians. What we'll do tonight is I'll give you some background, basically, is what we're going to look at, is what's behind it. Every book, letter, historical book, poetical book in the scripture has a background to it. It just didn't appear. And the more that you study Paul, you realize that he was a very purposeful letter writer. And the commentators say that Paul actually really likes writing letters. He almost takes it as his identity. And there are guys, men and women, who have done their PhD on first century letter writing, which is, for me, it makes for interesting reading. That someone would actually carve out the time and the strength and the energy and the money to go and produce that, which becomes really a book. So there are books called Paul in First Century Letter Writing. It really looks at the whole purpose of it. And Ephesians is unique in that, I'll say it this way, it doesn't appear like Paul is addressing a problem. Okay, it doesn't look like he's addressing a problem.
Is there a way to make it a little
louder? Louder? Yeah? So maybe if you move forward. Yeah? Is it there too? So, okay, time out. You don't hear the hum? You hear me? Yes. That's good enough? No. Not coming out of the speakers. So the microphone, right? Yeah. So how about now? Is it louder? No. Yes, no. That's why I said there's like 6 seats right here. And 10. That's right. That's right. We'll take these seats away and just move everything forward. So I'll just walk up here. Okay. So it doesn't appear like Paul is addressing a problem in Ephesians, like he does with, say, Philippians or Colossians or certainly Corinthians and Galatians. Those epistles, you see that he's dealing with a problem. And Ephesians almost looks like it's just almost a manifesto for the church that Paul wrote. But we'll see that it is probably one of the most direct, one of the ways that he definitely directly addresses issues in the area that he's writing to. And if you were here for I'm trying to think what number sermon it was. I did 3 messages on Ephesians, on the unveiling or uncovering the mystery, that the word to the church at Ephesus or to the saints at Ephesus is not in the earliest documents. So it's not until like the 3rd or 4th century that the word even comes out, or the words appear in any manuscripts to the church at Ephesus or to the faithful at Ephesus. I'm trying to think how he words it. However, all of the significant church fathers who were disciples of the apostles all quote Ephesians as Paul's letter to the Ephesians. So even though it doesn't appear, in other words, this was probably a circulatory letter. It was something that went around to a whole group of churches, and for certain reasons, and we'll see. And if you do the Bible Project study and you go and look at their video for Ephesians, Paul deals with, Tim Mackey deals with the idea that this letter is an uncovering, it's a revelation. And Paul uses either the word for revelation or symbolic ideas of revealing something, makes known to you these things. And it's very clear in it. And both Les and I, if you haven't ever seen it on the Bible Project, but they do what they call classroom, where they pick a subject and spend 15 hours dealing with it. And Ephesians is one of them. And when I was studying Ephesians on my own back in the spring and came across that, so I just jumped in. And basically it was recorded 3 years ago, I think, but it's a very small group of people, select group of people that actually you can write in and try to get into one of the classes. And if they select you, they'll pay your way to Portland, do the whole thing where you can sit in the classroom and deal with it. I'm not sure I've been denied like twice already, so they probably think he's an old guy, he doesn't need this. That's what I think anyway. So let's look at uncovering God's mystery. And that word, let's just say this, that word apocalypse, that we think of apocalyptic literature, that word apocalypse has taken on a meaning of its own through the people's interest in the book of Revelation. That name for Revelation is apocalypse. And basically the word just means uncovering. My dog has toys, and every once in a while the toys end up underneath a blanket. They're stuffed animals. He doesn't chew stuffed animals. We don't know why, and he knows them by name. Those are just little tidbits. But he will try to nose the blanket away because the toy is underneath it. And all we do is we just uncover it. That's the word apocalypse. It's just taking the cover off of something. And so what Paul says in Ephesians was that God created everything, but he created it with his mystery that was hidden. And after Jesus rose from the dead, he uncovered it, especially to Paul, and gave Paul this revelation that he shares in Ephesians. And you'll see how, I believe you'll see how the uncovering fits with the problem that he's dealing with, the issue that he's dealing with in the first century, that actually has been there for hundreds of years. And we'll read some of it tonight. We'll look into some of those things tonight. How many of you brought a Bible with you? Oh, great, look at that. Bringing a Bible to Bible study. What an idea. It's a revelation, that's right. Yeah, we'll see some of those things, so just have to make sure that everything works here. I will recommend books whenever I'm up here, because I can, and hopefully you'll buy it. This is a commentary that I think, I have probably 6 or 7 commentaries on Ephesians, maybe more. This is by far my favorite. And it's a little bit technical in places, But you'll see it's an exegetical commentary on the New Testament, and then up the side it says Ephesians. So the whole New Testament is part of this exegetical commentary, and that's what a lot of scholars do today. Is they'll select a publishing house, approach them and say, hey, we got this many people to write commentaries on the New Testament or the Old Testament. And so they'll sit around and they'll say, okay, what kind do we want? What kind of commentary do we want? Do we want one that is popular, that we could sell to just a general public? You don't get a lot of interest in that. How many of you own commentaries? Yeah, well, that's pretty good. This one, exegetical, means they're going to take the text apart. They're going to look at the text in a way that the general public won't look for. They're just not making comments on the verses, but they're really looking at the syntax of the Greek. And it helps if you at least know the Greek alphabet to start. There's only, from what Bill Mound says, there's about 300 words that make up 80% of the New Testament. So think, if you could learn those 300 words, you would be able to understand, at least in a very primitive way or very surface way, the New Testament, 80% of it in the original language. And you'll see some of the ways that this is translated, or Ephesians is translated when we start to look at that, as to how this is done. Because I learned my family's Italian, which was really a Sicilian, New York conglomeration of Neapolitan and Sicilian dialect when I was a little kid. And they scrunched the language. I mean, they did what everybody else does who's an immigrant that comes to the United States and speaks American English, butcher the original language. And then I learned Spanish in high school. Then I learned Vietnamese when I was overseas. I worked with the Vietnamese for 9 months of my 15 months that I was there. There's no two languages that translate exactly that I know of. You never can get a word-for-word translation from one language to another. And when we think of this language, Greek, Koine Greek, it is 2,000 years ago that they spoke this language. You ever read Shakespeare?
Yeah, not in the original language. It's very confusing.
It's very, not only is it confusing, but the words, his vocabulary is like foreign to us.
And some of the words don't mean the same thing.
They don't mean the same.
Today. Like when he says, get you to a nun, he's not saying go to a nun's place of residence.
Yeah.
He's talking about a whorehouse.
Just for sake, when you're making comments, if you want to make a comment, we got to give you a microphone.
Okay, sorry.
That's all right, because there are people on the other side of the world that are going to watch this video, just so you know. So make your comments really good. Yeah, so just from English, from 500 or 600 years ago, some parts of English really have changed. If you go to Wales today and listen to their English, or to Scotland, you'll hear a very different English that you're used to, just the way that they'll phrase words and use words. So when you think about it, this language is 2,000 years old, has to be translated into 21st century, a modern 21st century, when I say modern, modernist, 21st century culture that makes sense to us. That's why there are so many translations, and that's why translations keep on getting revised. That's why they keep on updating them. And another reason why they're updating them is because of documents, manuscripts that are being found that are not New Testament manuscripts, but they're cultural letters or books or descriptions of things, and they see the way this word was used in that context, and it just tweaks the way that they've been translating this word in the New Testament. And so they realized they've got another source to go ahead and make this more exact than it was. And that's why we have the kinds of things that we have. So getting back to this book, this is a tremendous commentary. And I'm going to use some of the way that he dissects the language. He does a lot of using clauses and how Paul builds things. And I don't know if we mentioned it at any time. You should try to read the book at least once a week while we're doing this study. If it takes, how long does it take to read it? Half hour? I mean, if you're going slow, you could do it every day. Yeah. Okay, so this book here is one that I would say needs to come up. There it is. If you're going to have a book on your bookshelf that is going to help you with all of the New Testament, this is the book. This is a book to have on your shelf. If you're going to buy one book, this is the one I would buy. It's the New Testament in Antiquity. It's by Gary Burge, Lynn Cohick, and Gene Green. And it is not just a nice book, and I like books. It's just filled with great information. They really did their homework. Gary Burge is one of the best commentators that I know that really relates things in a way that are apprehendable. You really can get your mind around it. I like what Gary Burge does in his commentaries. He does some commentaries. He did some on John, and but that certainly would be the book that I would have on my shelf, which I do. I've got it on Kindle too, so I can quote from it. New Testament History by Richard Niswanger is another book. That's a paperback. It's not as expensive as the other one. But we talk about books you're going to have on your shelf and really use to study the New Testament, which I think is an important thing to do. And my plug is that Jesus doesn't only call us to read the Bible, he calls us to study the Bible. That we should all be a student at some level. Some of us are more of a student or a learner, but we should all be able to study the Bible. As an apologist, you have to be able, I would say you have to be able to not only declare your faith, you have to be able to defend your faith. You should be able to give reasons why you believe the New Testament is reliable, why Jesus is alive from the dead, and why God exists, why miracles exist. You should be able to at least do those four things. And you can get so much from understanding the Scripture and see how it is just a great way of the way God has put the Bible together or allowed the Bible to be put together, purposed the Bible to be put together, is just a really phenomenal thing. There's nothing like it. Okay, so these get a little bit, these are extra if you want to have them. I love background. I love culture. So I go toward these kinds of things. History gives us culture, but it also gives us perspective. Maybe I'm saying the same thing. It helps us understand something when we know history. Like, I agree with Neil Postman where he says that before you study science, you should study the history of science. Before you study math, you should study the history of math. Before you study almost any subject, you should study the history of it. Why is this subject worth studying? Where did it come from? How did we get to this place? And so when we look at the Bible, we ought to be people that we understand the history of it. And this is, I found this book really helpful when I was doing my master's degree. It's called The Greco-Roman World of the New Testament Era. So it deals with a whole part of early Christianity, but even goes into the intertestament period. That's the period between Malachi and Matthew. What happened in those 400 years that really shaped the world that John the Baptist walked into. And so you understand really let me say it this way. We don't see the influence of Rome in Palestine in the first century. We don't see really the influence of it other than you see a centurion here or there. But how much did the Roman Empire influence the Jews of the first century? That's a question. And how much were they influenced by the Greeks? That basically they beat the Greeks out. They threw the Greeks out in the first century before Jesus came. And that's where the Herods came from, basically. And all the history that led up to that place, it gives you context now that you understand who John the Baptist is. See, and what he's stepping into. When you open the Bible and you see, here's John the Baptist shows up here. And part of what I've done when I've gone to South Africa is taught Bible background and taught some of the Gospels, and always put the Gospel in a context and let them see why Matthew wrote the way he wrote, why Luke wrote the way he wrote, what happened in the book of Acts, and just all of those things, how they all fit together. This is a great book for that, and this is the last one that I'll push on you. This one, I would say, if you really love books and want to get into it, it's The Rise of the Greeks, and basically where the Greek Empire came from. So it starts with Philip of Macedonia, who's Alexander's father, and then traces the whole history of the Greeks as they walked through the world and conquered cities. That's by Michael Grant. I'll still go back to this. Some of the things I did when I was doing my doctor of ministry was I had to write courses that could be taught in church or in a classroom. And one of them was on New Testament background, and I was able to pick that. So I was able to use all of these books. And so what we'll do tonight is we'll look at a little bit of the background of the epistle to the Ephesians. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the land, Paul himself, and then Ephesus, and the importance of Ephesus. So those three things are basically what we'll do tonight. Okay. Where's our microphone? Any questions? Are you thrilled? There you go, right answer. Yeah, we're good? All right. If I can get my computer to obey here. This is the Mediterranean basin, yeah? We're familiar with this? Unfortunately, today, a lot of young people don't even know what that is. They're not taught geography anymore. Okay, so I see strained eyes. I know we're dealing with older folks here. That blue thing there, that's the Mediterranean Sea. And on the eastern end of it, this is Palestine in here. Palestine, Syria, in this area here, right? This part that today is called Turkey was called Asia, or Asia Minor in the New Testament. That's what it was known as. And that's where the region to the Galatians is, and that's where Ephesus is. Ephesus is on the western side of it. It's facing the Aegean Sea that faces Greece. This is Greece right here. Up here is Macedonia, down here was Achaia, which is another name for Greek. And there's the homeland right there. Do you know that it's an equal distance from Jerusalem to Corinth and Corinth to Rome? Interesting. And all connected by water. But from Jerusalem to Corinth is the same, I think it's 950 miles, and then it goes another 950 miles to Rome. And so you can see why Paul chose Corinth. And he writes from Corinth, I want to get to Rome. You know, that's really what I want to do. And fortunately, we had Luke, who was a historian, doctor, very sophisticated language, and traveled with Paul for most of the book of Acts. But he basically documents all of Paul's journeys. as well as the early church. But that's basically the land, and that's why we have this today. We have most of the history of how the gospel spread to the west, but almost no history of where it went to the east. And we have some history of it going down into Africa, going down into Egypt, Ethiopia, and we can kind of piece a few things together. If you meet an Ethiopian Christian today, he'll tell you what, if you know an Ethiopian Christian? They have the oldest church in existence. It would be something like the Coptics, but they will say that they have the oldest Bible in existence and they have the oldest church in existence. Because of what? Ethiopian eunuch, yeah. Yeah, they'll tell you that. And that's just to the south and west of Egypt. Okay, so this is basically the conquest of Alexander. He starts out just across from his homeland in Greece, and he travels all of this distance, which is probably 1,300 miles, maybe more, into the foothills of India. And they conquer everything, including Afghanistan. Sorry. And then they make a sweep and they go back all the way down. They conquer everything through Israel into Egypt, where that city called Alexandria is named for Alexander. Good guess. And it becomes, anybody know what Alexandria was known for? Library. Largest library in the world. You know what happened to it? It burned like a matchbox because it was filled with 1 million volumes, over 1 million volumes of papyri. Yeah. And so burnt, not a shred left. But if you remember Apollos in the book of Acts, it says he was an Alexandrian. And they just assumed, or at least put on him, that he was well educated. And he was eloquent in his speech. Why? Because Alexandria had like colleges and universities and places to train in things like rhetoric, which is what one of the things the Greeks were known for. Anybody know who tutored Alexander? Some smart guy. No? Wasn't Plato, it was Aristotle. Yeah, Aristotle was his tutor. Imagine. Aristotle wrote 2,500 years ago. We're still using his books. Still reading his books. Yeah, that's pretty good. You think anything written today is going to last 2,500 years? Okay, so that gives us a little bit of the picture of the land that basically is the larger part of what we're dealing with. Now the gospel, when the gospel goes, it goes, according to Paul, goes all the way through Asia Minor, through Macedonia, makes a couple of trips, and goes all the way to Rome. And if we understand what the church fathers told us, even got to Spain at one point. But this is a blow up of just the western part of Asia Minor, or what we call Turkey today. And these golden brownish kind of things, those are Roman roads. So it shows you if you look at some of these older documents, or older maps rather, they'll show you what it looked like before the Romans got there. And then as soon as the Romans get there, this happens. They build roads, and if you travel to these places, whether it's Greece, even England, you can stand on Roman roads. They're all over the place. And 2,000 years ago they built these things, and they're still there. We're driving on them today. And basically, they wanted to be able to get a legion of soldiers at the drop of a hat to quell any kind of uprising within so many miles. So they built roads in order to do that. And they called it the Pax Romana, which was the peace of Rome. And basically they could control, they could attack everything that was trying to disrupt. And the main thing that they were looking for was tributes. They were looking for a way to get the money back to Rome. That's all they were looking for. Even back then, they were extorting everybody. Basically, Pilate was a tax collector. His job was to make sure that the Jews paid their due taxes. That's all he really cared about. He wanted to make sure everything stayed nice and calm, but make sure everybody paid their dues. And so when the gospel comes, we hear the phrase in Galatians, in the fullness of time. So basically you have a language that can go from Spain all the way to India, that they can speak the same or understand the same language, which was Koine Greek. And then you have the Romans come along and have not only roads, but sea passages that you could travel from one place to the other in relative peace and speed. You could get there fast. So this is the fullness of time. And if you notice where this road is here, right in the middle of it, it goes to Ephesus in one place, and down to Miletus or Miletus in the other. But you see that there's mountains to the north of it, south. There's actually a river that runs through this valley here. And this is all leading to Ephesus. And Ephesus becomes the leading city and eventually becomes the capital of Asia because of its prominence. And I want to read some things. Actually, I want to read chapter 19 later on, where in Acts, that is, where they have, Paul is having a good old time there. So, if you notice here, here's Colossae. That's where the letter to the Colossians wrote. Laodicea in Revelation, there's a letter that goes there. And this is free, no charge at all for this, okay? What does Jesus say to the church at Laodicea? That's still quoted today. Right, he writes in the first part of Revelation, you are neither what? Hot nor cold. And then he says, but you are lukewarm, right? And I'll spit you out of my mouth. The Greek basically says, I'll vomit you out. It's kind of really, okay. So how do we interpret those verses? That you're a lukewarm Christian. You ever hear that term? So would you rather be a cold Christian or a lukewarm Christian? If you use it following that analogy, right? If you're lukewarm, the understanding is you should be a hot Christian, right? That's the inference, right? And so you interpret it, but Jesus says you're neither hot nor cold. You're lukewarm. I would say that's pretty good. I'm lukewarm most days, right? But if you don't understand the context, here's a plug for it. Hierapolis had hot springs. Colossae had cold springs. The Romans built aqueducts to Laodicea, where you could get hot water or cold water. Changes the whole meaning of the text, doesn't it? Jesus is saying, you're not what I'm looking for. You're neither hot nor cold. Yeah? Some of you could see the light in your eyes. Some of you are kind of like still in the fog, just like, it's okay. But you see, the context and the geography help you understand what the text is saying. Because every book is written in a context. It's written in a historical time, in a geographical area that has culture affecting the writer and the readers. And that's how you have to understand the Bible. You know, I've said the Bible just didn't just fall out of the sky. It just, the Muslims believe that about the Quran. They believed that it was automatic writing. And nobody actually wrote it, it was spoken first. And it wasn't written down for hundreds of years. It was the spoken word that Allah spoke to Muhammad, and Muhammad spoke it, and then his disciples and their disciple, finally somebody started to write it down. Yeah? If you understand Islam and where a lot of Muslims don't even know that. They don't even know the history of their own book. But our New Testament is written in a context. Our Old Testament is written in a context too. And we understand these things, or we should understand these things. Okay, here's a nicer picture of it, and it shows really the interest of what we're going to talk about. And the reason why you have this in your notes, whoever did this map, it's just these cities that are in the western part there, and what happens at Ephesus. I will read Ephesus, Acts chapter 19. And these are most of the towns or cities that Jesus writes to or speaks to, except for Hierapolis, Philadelphia, Smyrna, Thyatira, and Ephesus in the book of Revelation. And again, if you like geography, this is where I get nerdy. I mean, but you could see why Paul went certain ways. Like in Acts, it says that when he went to Ephesus the second time, he went in the northern route around the mountain. So he went up north and traveled all the way around that way rather than down the valley, which would have been easier for him to do. Okay. So when we look at cities in the New Testament, in the Roman Empire, there are two types of cities. There were colonies like Corinth. Corinth was a colony. And basically what the Romans did was they went to their retiring army, those who were too old to fight anymore, and they would offer them land in places that they wanted to colonize. So here again, first chapter of Corinthians, it says to us when Paul is writing to the Corinthians that not many wise, not many powerful, right? When he's writing to the Corinthians, somebody know that part of the, yeah? Is he saying that God just chooses dummies and weaklings? Is that what he's talking to? No, he's talking to people who had no worth in the Roman Empire because they were the retirees from the army. Julius Caesar settled Corinth in about 65, somewhere in there, somewhere between 65. He was killed in 44, I think it was. It was when he was a general. He basically sent retirees to settle Corinth. And they were not many wise, not many noble, not many powerful. They were the working class. And then he goes on to say that God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. Yeah, because he just took ordinary people and put them there. But the context, that gives you the context of it. You don't learn that until you go back and you read the history of Corinth. How did it start? See, Ephesus was about 1,000 years old when Paul got there. The city had been there 1,000 years. The temple to Diana, Artemis, in the, I guess the colloquial language or the local language, Diana was the Roman name for it, was one of the 7 wonders of the world. That the temple was so huge, it was so huge and magnificent that it's still called one of the, doesn't exist anymore, one of the 7 wonders of the world. When Paul got there, it's 1,000 years old. Yeah. And does anybody, before I read it, does anybody remember what happens in Acts chapter 19 when Paul goes to Ephesus? Well, not when he goes there, it's when he starts to convert people. The silversmiths, who were making what? They were making statues of Diana. They said, this new religion is really not helping us. It's not good for business, yeah. And They went into a stadium that could seat 25,000 people. That's how big the stadium was when they went in there, and they got into a frenzy chanting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Yeah? And they shouted for 2 hours. And Paul wanted to go in there and preach. Yeah, and nobody would let him go. His disciples wouldn't let him go. The important people he knew wouldn't let him go. It even says some women who were high up as Asiarchs, as part of this whole culture, wouldn't let him go, told him, "Don't go there. This is not a good thing to do." Because, we would think, how many people? A couple of hundred people were there? No, there were probably thousands of people filling the stadium. It said the whole city turned out and filled the stadium and started doing this to challenge or to cry out against what Christianity was doing. Okay, so 2 types of city. Ephesians is a Roman city. It's a free city. It's not a colony. So if you're born in Ephesus, you don't pay taxes. A Roman city, which was a free city, not a colony. Remember, I said there's 2 kinds. There's colonies. Ephesus was a free city. And probably because of its prominence, it becomes very relevant to this whole understanding. And what we don't understand today, and you won't understand it unless you go to a third world country today, or even maybe some countries in the Mideast, you won't understand the importance of their cult religions that they have and how they affect the population, how they affect the people that are there. And that's one of the things that we'll see in Ephesians here. So 2 types of city, and again, Ephesians or Ephesus is a free city. So it had all these: Ephesus, Smyrna, Tarsus, Antioch in Syria. There's actually 2 or 3 Antiochs. The one in Syria is where Paul keeps going back. And Thessalonica are all free cities. So it's not just those colonies that are there. Okay, Paul the Apostle. Where does Paul come from? You ought to know Paul was first seen as Saul. And that was his Jewish name. Paul was born in Tarsus, which was in Asia. It was on the south coast of Asia there. That's where he grew up, and he was born a Roman citizen. So just do a little bit of thinking here. He's going to be trained by the Pharisee of Pharisees, Gamaliel, right? Gamaliel was the who's who in Pharisees and teaching young boys Pharisaic law, the Torah and so on and so forth. But he's a Roman citizen. So you got to ask the question, don't you? How'd that happen? How does he become, well, he says he's born a Roman citizen. Right? When he's talking to the centurion says, I paid a lot of money to become a Roman citizen. He says, yeah, but I was born that way. It was like, my standard's a little bit better than yours. I didn't buy my way into this. I was born into it. So in other words, I've got some generational history here. Well, again, if you don't understand the Greek influence on Judaism in that intertestament period, none of this really makes sense. We just gloss over those things. What language do you think Paul grew up speaking living in Tarsus?
So it's good to end on a question, at least this part on a question. And again, just to remind you, I asked the question, what language do you think Paul spoke growing up? Remember that all the Jews who had gathered at Pentecost and heard the sound of that mighty rushing wind came, and when they heard the apostles and that whole crowd speaking, they said, how can this be that we hear them speaking in our own dialects? And it names men from all over Asia, even Egypt and parts of Africa, Syria. They were from all over the known world at that time. And they were all listening to people speaking their own dialect, meaning that they spoke another language other than Aramaic. And I would propose that they also spoke Greek, because they went to the church, or rather the synagogue of the Hellenists, which was a Greek-speaking synagogue there in Jerusalem. Just to give you a little bit more of the background. Things I repeat, but helps to hear them again. Hope you enjoyed this lesson, or this part of this lesson, and the next part of this first lesson will also embellish things, and we'll have some Q&A at the end of it.